If you can hear me, right?
This is Scott
Okay.
Loveridge with the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. I'm pleased to host today's webinar on the topic that you see before you. The way that these work is participants can enter their questions in the chat box as we move along, and we'll get those questions answered as they come up. Our speakers today are Peter Schaeffer and Randall Jackson, both from West Virginia University. Peter is a professor of agricultural and resource economics, and he also holds an appointment in economics. And Randy Jackson is director of the Regional Research Institute and a professor of geology and geography. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Peter.
Thanks very much, and thanks also to Rosa Solis, who helped us get ready for this. I appreciate all the help that she provided. As you can see, the title has changed a little bit, but I want to make sure you understand the content of the presentation has not changed. It's still and looking at incubators, and particularly non-metro incubators. This was a teamwork, as you can see there by the names of three individuals from West Virginia University. Xiaoming Cheng, who started out at WVU but then got a job at Florida International, and Kingsley Haynes and James Riggle at George Madison University. We appreciate and acknowledge the support from the USDA. We had a grant for this work, and again, we appreciate the work of NCRCRD for hosting this presentation. Now let me get in. Oops, it's not my normal PowerPoint. Business incubators are discussed quite widely, and there are good reasons for it, because the United States, as all industrialized countries for the most part, are not competitive on cost. There is no longer a possibility for competing on the basis of cost. It's happening to all of them, it seems, eventually. And so our competition has to be on the matter of innovation, quick response, quality, and quick response and things like that are part of the of quality. The term comes back from its start about some 50 years ago in upstate New York, and apparently they were called incubators, a fitting name, but also because it started in a building that used to be an incubator. And what they do is they provide various business services to business who are startups usually, and help them get access to some services that they might not yet be able to afford on their own. And in return, one hopes and would assume that they have a positive effect on the success of startups, that the survival rate should be higher than without such assistance. Okay, now why do we look especially at rural incubators? Well, as you see, and as you know, rural economies are in many respects quite different from urban economies. Not so much in the industry structure anymore. Manufacturing is big there as well, and agriculture on average is not as big anymore, even in rural counties, relative to other sectors. There are many aspects, therefore, where they differ in terms of scale, market access, and so on. And so the assumption is, or the hypothesis is, one of them, that starting a new business in a rural environment is more difficult than in an urban environment. And because of that, we think that to assess the efficacy of a rural versus an urban incubator, we need to distinguish between them, because the rural incubator operates in a more difficult environment, and therefore, if that incubator is less or looks less successful, having fewer graduations and maybe a lower survival rate than an urban one, we cannot from them from that information conclude that the rural incubator has an inferior performance. That's really the heart of the research question that we still are trying to answer. We obtained data from a survey, and we distinguish between metropolitan versus micropolitan distinctions. And as probably most of you know, but just to be sure we know what we're talking about, metropolitan counties are those with an urban core of more than 50,000. There were almost 1,100 of these in the lower United States. Micropolitan counties have an urban core larger than 10,000, but below 50,000. There are 674 in the United States. And then that's a tough one to, it's a bit like the NCRC, it's a long one, OCBSA, outside core, oops, mistaken there, outside core-based statistical areas, there are almost 1,400 in the United States. So those are those counties, obviously, that have no town of a significant size, if we define 10,000 as being significant. We had a good response rate for something like this of 29%. But I also want to mention just quickly that our responses mirror the population that we were able to identify quite well. And we started with a list of over 1,100. Very helpful was information from the NBIA, the National Business Incubating Association. And what we did is we followed up on entries in their membership to make sure that they were still active. Not just that they were still in existence in a legal way, but that they were still active. And a few of them were not incubators as well. So that we whittled it down to 719. So you see we have 209 respondents, and as I said, about 3/4 of them metro, about 1/6 micro, and the rest OCBSA. The distribution follows, at least in part, the population densities. Okay. You have a place here. You see several here. Chicago. You see here. Oops. The Bay Area, and so on. And of course, you see the eastern coast there very clearly as well. What's interesting here, we won't talk about it, but just to alert you to this, is Oklahoma. You see there is a concentration of them, and it is because Oklahoma, the state, is very organized in working with and through incubators. We also saw where they kind of clustered, but please notice these are not clustered, not functional clusters in the way that we might understand it in some of our regional development work. But these are proximity clusters. They're close to each other, in other words. Does not mean that there could not be some of them functional clusters, but I suspect most of them are not. You see, of course, here again, a famous group of incubators in the Bay Area. You see here Chicago very clearly, and Milwaukee, and the east. I have to get used to that mouse, and the eastern seaboard once again. All right. Let's see the presentation has the following outline. We're going to look at incubators, and we're trying to present what they look like, what we have found out about them. And we are using 8 criteria. The criteria are based on a best practices list that is available at the National Business Incubation Association's NBIA website. And we start with the legal organization, and then you see revenues and funding more generally. Then we look at size and capacity, strategy and mission. whether they have an industry focus on a particular industry or not. Do they have admission requirements for tenants? Do they have graduation requirements for tenants? And then finally, reporting and tracking. You can see a little bit, of course, that particularly 7 and 8 are not completely independent one from the other. Organization is as you would expect. Most of them are private, but almost all of them are not-for-profit. There is only a small segment that is for profit, as you can see on this graph on your left. And it doesn't matter really if it's Metro, Micro, or OCBSA. They're not the same, obviously, and some of the differences look like they should be statistically significant. I don't remember right now on top of my head. But in kind of a larger sense, they look very similar in that regard. We have found also in our work that universities and colleges and technical schools as well play an important role as sponsors and hosts of incubators. And you see this particularly in the case of metro areas where there is a significant percent, 40% plus, but I think it's 42% rounded, of the metro incubators that we were able to identify are co-located, whereas in rural counties, if we define again OCBSA as rural, it's only about 25%, and the micro are somewhere in between. I don't think we need to say a lot more about the organization for our purposes. We just need to know that most of them are not in it for the money, and that the public sector probably also plays a significant role, or the not-for-profit sector. That was very clear in there. Now, a non-for-profit organization, as I said, most incubators are not-for-profit. They still have to depend, most of them, on an income. They need some regular income that they can count on, otherwise they are not capable of planning ahead. And so we wanted to ask the question of where do you earn money? How do you earn money? And we found that rent to be very important, particularly actually in the rural areas. There are also other fees, as you can see. But if you look at the rent and fees and rent together, you see that in OCBSA, that means everybody, all 16 that we surveyed. In the micro area, it's close, and in metro area, it's a little less, but it's still very large. And that's going to be an important point when we talk about their performance later on. I already said that government will play an important role, and you see on the left, again, this will be Metro, Micro, and OCBSA. And you see that basically almost everybody, not quite everybody, but 4/5 of the incubators, and a bit more actually, at one time or another got support from some level of government. If you look at the last 12 months, then you see more differences. And it's difficult for us to say whether or not this is systematic or whether this is maybe just a fluke, because we did the survey in 2010, and 2010. So the economy was not exactly brilliant yet, and that may have played a role as well. Here a little bit more detailed breakdown, and what you see here, that although the private sector plays an important role, so do all levels of government, but particularly the federal government, because the federal government sometimes together with state and local, sometimes only with the state, and sometimes by itself alone, provides a high share of provide sometimes a high share of the funding. It's not always a high share. I should have probably made this clearer in the title, but let me correct my oversight now. We're not looking here at how much do they pay, but what percentage of incubators have received financial support from a combined group of federal, state, and local, so like in this case here for the metro area. Local only plays a role, and it's not a small role. It's close to 10% and a bit more than 10% in micro and a little less in OCBSAs. But it's not unimportant, and also, of course, sometimes they work with other levels of government, with the state or with the local level as well. So we see here that our financial makeup is quite diverse. They get support from different levels of government. They get support from rents and fees and so on, and they get money potentially from lenders. Now, the money they get from lenders is most of the time not for themselves. I mean, usually not for themselves, but for their tenants. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later. One of the most important steps in helping a startup business is to make that business bankable. And so what you really want, eventually, what you would like is that all businesses that you work with are in this area here, all of them. So you want that this greenish area becomes the bulk of what you have. Because those that work together with private lender and one government, usually the federal or the state, and a bank contributes as well or is part of the loan team, lending team. That's usually a good sign because it means that there is, or sometimes it's usually a good sign because it means that they are starting to build a track record that will be helpful later on to move into the more desired area, as we said. So this is an important slide, and we see that here the differences by region are really quite large. How many receive university from a college, from a university or college or technical school was a question we asked as well, because we heard and we quickly saw that institutions of higher learning or professional learning played a significant role. And as you can see here, that in metro area, quite a large part is assisted by a university, college, or technical school, which corresponds to a slide that we saw earlier when we saw that in metro area, the share of incubators that were co-located with a university, college, or technical school was the highest. And then you see that it goes down in the micro, and then of course it's, well, yeah, it is a way, of course, it is the lowest in the rural area. What's interesting, and I don't think unexpected at all, is that the order in a way is reversed when you look at reliance on universities for some resources. Technical knowledge, skills, physical facility, and human resources. Particularly those who partner with a college. They often find ways to involve faculty, or they actually started out because some faculty were entrepreneurial and needed a place that would help them start their business. We also saw one where the involvement of students had kind of started to grow and looked quite interesting. What they do not get is a lot of, they being incubators, is a lot of financial support from venture capital, or frequent from venture capital firms. or an angel fund. I put down in parentheses a bit smaller to make sure we know what we talk about. What we mean by an angel fund is an individual venture capitalist as to a investment firm or capital firm. And you see whether it's metro, micro, the share that comes from there, that obtain money that way, is not very high. It's the highest in the micro. I don't have an explanation for that. And none of the 16 that we had in rural areas received any support. All right, let's now go to size and capacity. We now have some idea a little bit about where do the different financial resources come from. Where does some operating budget come from? Where does some lending capital come from, and so on. And now we want to look at what they do with it. What is the size and capacity of these incubators that we studied? Let's start with the annual operating budget. That's not a bad first cut to get some idea of what's happening. And what you see here very clearly is that none of the incubators, well, I shouldn't say none, but with very few exceptions, maybe none, incubators are not very large. As you can see, those who are above 1.5 million are a very small component of the total population. And even those between 1 million to 1.5 million is not large. A little bit more, particularly in metro area, for the next group, between 500,000 and 1 million. And the biggest one in all are small ones, with only 200,000, or sorry, with less than 200,000. The share, again, something expected, is particularly high in OCPSA counties, quite high also in metro, less than 50%, sorry, in micro, less than 50% in metro, but still the single largest group. So what we can say here, if the incubator population that we were able to identify reflects incubators currently in the United States, they're usually a small business. And I think that is probably the case. I think that in this respect, our survey is representative. Let's quickly look at budget trend over here. And as you can see, it's declining for a few, like about 1/5, a bit more in metro and OCPSA, a little less than that, well, actually about half of that in the micro areas down here. You see, about the same is the single largest group. That's the one, I'm not sure if that's really red, but let's call it red. And growing is not a bad component of the total population in metro, and even in micro regions, or counties, sorry, but it's not very large, at least in the rural counties, in the OC, which again is defined as outside core-based statistical areas. Now, the second thing that we want to look at, do you have regular contact with venture capitalists? That's a very reasonable question to ask, since the goal is to grow a business from its beginnings, early beginnings, into a business that could be sold. That doesn't have to be sold, but it could be sold. Somebody else could take it over. Sorry for that really eye-blinding yellow, but the color that I had in there before was not very visible on the screen, and now I went to the other extreme here. And as you can see that in the rural regions, contact with venture capitalists is uncommon, because the bulk of them doesn't have any, and those who have, about 25%, don't have very frequent contacts. Okay. Again, in this case, the metro areas and the micro areas differ, or more generally, the more urbanized areas differ. But they're not the same either. They're the same in terms of the no, those who have no contacts, here and here. But you can see they differ here, and they differ here with respect to individual investors and venture capital firms. This, again, this one I think is somewhat expected, that you will find more of that in a metro area. But other than things that kind of intuitively I expected, I can't give you a good reason for this. And then here, small numbers, about the same percentage in metro and micro. So again, to summarize this slide, regular contact with venture capitalists is relatively uncommon in all incubators. Then how long have to be in operation? Because capacity usually at least stabilizes and hopefully grows with years of operation. And what you see that those who are 15 years or older make up not a huge percentage, but 20% in the metro areas up here, and about 12-13% in the micro and OCSB regions here respectively. Then those that are between 10 and 15, again more in the metro areas, about the same percentages in the micro and urban areas. Looks like about 17%. And on the other hand, the really small ones, the second smallest group is not highly represented, or not as highly represented as in micro or OCSB. In the metro areas, larger in share in the micro areas, and even larger share in OCPSA areas. But then micro and metro are fairly similar with really small incubators. I would call an incubator that has been in operation for 0 to 4 years. Most of them are small and not as experienced. And I actually came away from our interviews with the impression that some of the incubators themselves are struggling businesses and could use some incubation services. Another aspect of size, of course, we looked at the bid budget earlier, that would have fit in here as well. And we have seen that the budgets are generally not very large, not above 1.5 million. And here we see kind of the relationship between these two graphs, the budget graph and the full-time employees or full-time position graph. Interestingly enough, the share of incubators with more than 15 positions, 16 or more, is larger in micro areas by quite a bit. It's still small, but it's over 10% in micro areas and it's less than 5% in metro areas. It's not represented at all in our sample. Just to remind you once again, we only have 16 observations among the OCPSA. Because of that, for some of our research, I don't include it here, we've actually pulled micro and OCPSA together to see if there was a significant break between metro and the rest of the population. And we found some of that. And again, what I said, you see that the larger ones, let's say those larger than 10, are represented mostly in the micro areas, or large in the micro areas. But there are quite a few of them in the OCPSA areas. It could be that they have been working on there longer, they've had more time to develop. That wouldn't completely surprise me, because the first incubator was not really in a completely rural area, but was not in a big metro area either. And then you see what you would expect is that the really small ones are somewhat underrepresented to the total, but not by much in metro areas, a little bit higher in micro, and not really that much higher in OCPSC, not much higher than Metro, that is. Now another question is, are you successful? Then if you're successful, you sometimes have a queue, a waiting list. And the percentages who report that they, I probably should have been more optimistic and put in the reverse of this graph is the yes, but I put in the no, because I wanted to show you that a lot of incubators, percentage-wise, have never had a waiting list of prospective tenants, of qualified tenants. Those who had are largest in the metro areas, and there's not much difference between micro and OCPSA. And those who currently have a waiting list, which is the graph on your right-hand side over here, you see that those who currently have a waiting list is relatively well represented in metro and micro. So here it is the metro and the micro that are similar, whereas over here it was the metro with respect to ever had a waiting list. It was metro and rural. I'm not sure if that means anything, but it's kind of interesting. And here, as I said, the metro and the micro are similar, and none of the 16 incubators in in the rural counties had a waiting list at the time of our survey. To look a little bit more at capacity, we saw some indication from budget and so on, and from number of employees, that most incubators are small, and that impression was kind of also came out a little bit in terms of age, because most businesses start out with a relatively small number of employees, often only one. And since a relatively large share of incubators is relatively new, we expected that as another indication of smallness. What we see here is that, again, this of course is expected, that the number of tenants at full capacity is the largest in the metro area. I would expect it to be better than OCPSA in the micro area too, but it isn't, as you can see here by the comparison of these two. And also down here in the comparison of the smallest ones with 5 or less employees. That one I'm not sure what to make of. It could mean a number of things. It could mean that there is less need, because, as you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and micro areas have some of the quicker growing counties among them. But I don't know. And when you look at the leasable areas here, then you see a bit more of what you have expected, but still it's not a huge difference. In terms of those who are really small, meaning below 5,000 square foot, they're fairly evenly distributed among the 3 regions. And the largest ones are most common in metro areas and similar in micro areas and OCPSA. All right. So again, we confirmed, well, we found that most incubators are not large. And so we looked at services offered. And we asked them if they offered basic services or if they offered advanced services. The basic service responses are on the left side, and to make it a bit more difficult for you, I made one with no and the other with yes. Those who offer advanced services are on your right. By basic services, we mean what sometimes is referred to as secretarial support. It's actually a little bit more than that. It's access to a copier, maybe access to a meeting space. We found to be quite important for some businesses. And the receptionist, somebody who answers the phone, so that you don't come across as unprofessional to one of your clients. Meaning now, the client of a tenant when they call you and nobody answers and they have to wait for a long time to leave a message, let alone to get a call back. So those are very important services, and because of that, it surprises me that the share of those who don't offer that is quite so high. And I am not sure what to make of this. I actually think that the population that is represented by this graph is dichotomous. I suspect that there is some really struggling incubators who are currently not much more than a place where appropriate space for a business is available to be leased. And then there are those who are working with a clientele who don't need these services. So I think they're dichotomous. And I think for what we are looking at, it's probably more interesting to look at the graph on the right-hand side. And as you can see here, when you look at advanced services, all of them, let's be careful here that the scale here, the wonders of Excel, does not finish at 0. So it's a different scale on the left and right, that they're all high. There are differences, and they are not that small. 5% is not a small difference, or 6% here, but they're not huge. They are somewhat similar. Most businesses provide more advanced services. That would be access to expensive equipment. We have seen that, for example, with respect to food industries, but also with respect to others. It could be to technical know-how, particularly in those that are associated, affiliated, and particularly those co-located with a university or college, management consulting, and so on. All right, let's look at the strategy and mission. And there, as you will see in a moment, there are some areas that I think one might want to think about and maybe address. On the left-hand side, you see a graph that asks the question, do you have a strategic plan? And you can answer yes or no. And as you can see, and that's really surprising to me, is that the percentage of those in metro areas that do not have a strategic plan is the highest, then not much lower in the micro areas, and at least somewhat lower in the OCBSA areas. But still, it's high in all of them. That really surprised me, particularly with today's emphasis on assessment. How can you have assessments if you don't know what your objectives, what your goals are? That will be tough, I think. Here, it became too big. Here, JC means job creation, firm creation or business creation. Here, both, and here, other. Other, in some cases, also means don't really know, not really sure, or influx or something like that. And as you can see, most of them have both missions. Most incubators have both missions assigned to them. And the difference is large with micro, more prevalent in micro areas. Sorry about the misspeaking. But again, it's clearly the largest of all three groups. I don't think that's necessarily bad, but it should worry us a little bit, because from research we know that you can't always succeed if you mix goals. And the most famous example that I know about is in the placement of unemployed people. A very famous example in the Chicago area, I think comes from the 1960s or 70s. That I'm not sure about anymore. Where they funded, I think it was the county, funded public placement offices and marketed that to firms. It was very unsuccessful. because the firm's goal was to find good, qualified, reliable employees, the government placement offices was to place the unemployed. Those two objectives are very often not compatible. And so we need to be careful here whether, and ask the question in each individual case, is that a compatible set of two aspects of our mission? Also worrisome is that regular self-evaluation, and this one puzzles me. I really don't know. You have, on the one hand, you have here that they don't do a regular self-evaluation, but then do an annual self-evaluation. I mean, it's kind of regular, I would have thought. And so if you want to be an optimist, you want to look at the right-hand graph. But still, we ought to be worried that apparently some of these incubators themselves, since they answered this question, feel that they don't do enough. That's what maybe one interpretation of the left-hand graph is. And particularly in the rural areas, even the right-hand side is not particularly pretty here. If only 63% do an annual self-evaluation, that means there are 37% who do not. And that's a large share. And even here, 10% is still a large share in the case of micro, or 13% in the case of macro. Or metro, sorry. What is the annual evaluation about? And here, evaluation is usually the evaluation of the incubator, not of the incubator's tenants. We come to that later. Assessment of current and future finances. Those who do assess, basically all incubators do that, particularly in rural areas. It's pretty close. Still a little lacking, but it's not too bad. It's certainly not as worrisome as it was in the previous slide. So, and in this case, the rural incubators seem to be the ones kind of most ready to check themselves. Assessment of client feedback, again, the rural incubators answered that. All of them answered that. Now again, we have only 16 observations in here. And so it does have a bit of a small sample property. If you would have 4 more and all of them would have said no, then this would look more similar to the metro and micro areas. So it's interesting, but I wouldn't attach too much weight to this at this point, unless we get more information. But it formulates maybe a question. The evaluation of internal processes, again, the rural incubators apparently do that. The incubator evaluates its own ability to develop and learn. A high share say yes, but the 16 rural ones all say yes. And as you see, in terms of the business process, it's not vastly different between metro and micro, only 2 percentage points. Bigger difference on the side of the ability to develop and grow and over time. This is a quick graph. Evaluation is one thing. It's good to have an evaluation, but if you have a bad or a poorly designed evaluation process, then it doesn't do you necessarily all that much good. And so we asked them whether or not the incubator evaluation conforms to the BSC standards. BSC is the balanced scorecard method. And basically, if you don't know what it is, I know what it is, but I don't know much about details with respect, particularly in this instance, yet. It basically means that if you meet these standards, you probably are okay. It's a little bit like a stamp of approval that you're doing a good job. Not surprisingly, a little bit, particularly as they're not sure because they may not be aware of it, they may not have checked. And then you have here the percentages that say, no, we don't. They seem to be aware of that. Sorry, yeah, don't know, I said that right, I believe. And then those who said yes is a small percentage. So that one is not hugely worrying, to me at least, because I think there are more in here, but still worrying because we would like, obviously, to have more that feel that they have a evaluation process that meets some widely accepted standard. All right, let's just try to do this a bit quicker, because I see that I've been talking for 45 minutes. Industry or sector focus. None, the majority, have none. Metro, micro, or OCBSC. Since the other side of this would be yes, we see that metro is most likely. And if they have an other focus, we have it over here. The rural areas say, the incubators in the rural areas say they have a different focus, like startups. Sorry, let me get the pointer over there. Startups, I can't read my own, make it a bit larger, or just, yeah. Sorry, existing businesses and existing businesses that are promising, meaning those that are in a sector that is growing or accelerating. Yeah. And then the rest are either not aware of their focus. I doubt that they have really no focus whatsoever, but they probably have an accidental one at that. And that part is largest in rural areas. Maybe it's a little bit there, in particularly poorer areas, that you get what you can. All right, admission requirements. You saw that's not part of the evaluation of prospective tenants, and later on in 7, the graduating tenants. How do we fare there? No formal admission requirement. It's bigger share than I would have expected, and again the order here is different than I would have expected initially, and because I didn't expect this, I'm not quite sure what to make of this. And then one of the most obvious requirements for admission would be a formal business plan. Is a formal business plan required? The majority says yes, but the share of those who say no is still surprisingly large. And again, at this time, I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. In a general sense, I do think what I have said before, that some of these incubators themselves are fledgling small businesses. They're struggling themselves with finances, with personnel issues. We saw some of that, but we saw that in visits that we conducted, and I'm not sure that those were necessarily representative. They might be, but I don't know. Now, admission depends on the review of a business plan. Don't ask me, to me it looks a little bit contradictory to what we saw on the previous slide. And again, the percentage is smallest in OCBSAs in this case, and so largest in the micro metro areas. The business plan must meet specific requirements. Well, you could either have just to have the business plan, then it could be that your business plan must be such that you're now ready for operation, that you could actually start. So you don't get to the incubator to make the very first steps, to take the very first steps to get ready. And the third one is operational business. that corresponds probably to quite an extent to the focus on existing businesses that we saw on the previous slide. Okay. Graduation requirements, kind of similar, but at the other end of the process. Are there specific graduation standards? Yes. Those who say yes, would be nice if it was bigger. So it really does, to me, more than almost any of the other slides, indicate that a relatively large share of incubators don't yet quite have the process in place that one would like to see in such an enterprise. And in an incubator business, it really is important to evaluate whether you do your tenants any good. And as you can see here, the percentages of those who say yes for all of them is below 50%. It's better for metro and micro, but it's very low for OCBSAs. Other graduation standards, here more explicit, will be a certain level of capital, and that's this one here. That color approach should also have made this really bright yellow. And then a certain number of employees, or a combination. And as you can see here, a combination. Again, this, to me at least, I wouldn't have answered it this way. All 16 say, yep, a combination. And I think what they probably mean, and I suspect that at the time, because we didn't know as much as we have learned since then, is that they don't have absolutely no graduation standards, but they may be more informal and may indeed have a combination of factors included. And one of the reasons has to do with the focus. And as you have seen, particularly in the rural areas, there is very little industrial focus. There is very little sectoral focus. It's the biggest, that part is most prevalent in metro areas, but even there it's not very large. And I can understand maybe this answer from that perspective, this answer here, this 100%, and even the high percentages in the micro and in the metro cases. I can understand them as a guess of what could explain it, that they do have standards, but that those who have sometimes very varied type of tenants in very different businesses and industries, that one standard just can't be applied to all of them if it's to make any sense whatsoever. So let's be optimistic and assume that my interpretation is correct. But we don't know that for sure yet. It's just one explanation of what we're seeing. Graduation and graduation graduates, one of the questions, of course, is, well, do you have to graduate when you meet our criteria? That's the first question. And the share of those who say yes is actually fairly high. Ideally, it should be 100% because that's the idea. But let's now look back at what we talked about. What are the revenue sources? What are revenue sources for some of our incubators? And here it really matters that rent for some of them, for some of these incubators, is a very important part of their revenue sources. And so unless they have somebody new in line, they're reluctant to tell a current tenant to leave for any reason. So even if they're successful, they don't necessarily.
There was a question
yeah.
on
go ahead.
Focusing on one industry. A lot of rural incubators are popping up around foods. Did you notice any of that in your survey? And if so, any comments on that?
We didn't see that much, and we got a mixed information on that in our visits. We were in the Carolinas, we, of course, in West Virginia, and at least one that I remember in Ohio, and a couple of others that I did not do, but my colleagues. And we didn't see that many, but we did see some. In one place who didn't have any, we asked them why, and they said it was too difficult to meet the FDA standards, various standards, not all necessarily FDA. And but we then, in another place, we saw a kind of an industrial type or kitchen where various entrepreneurs from the region came to prepare their products. Very common, certainly in many places, jams and sauces and spices and things like that. And so we saw both. So I just would say, based on the fact that some do it, that it is possible, and but that maybe the threshold fear might be a little bit high, depending on who is leading your incubator. And so, and that's another point I think that's important to consider when we look at planning for an incubator, or either improving one that we have or starting one, that we need to make sure that the person that we appoint to be the leader of this incubator has skills in the sector that we think is particularly promising.
If I could interject just for a moment.
Great,
this
please.
Is Randy Jackson. One of the question as I read it is, what are your thoughts about focusing on one industry such as foods for an incubator? I think that part of the response to that question also relates to the fact that incubators in small areas tend to draw from very small populations and really don't have the luxury of restricting the entrance to any one sector, although they certainly, and at the same time they will welcome entrance from most industries, particularly given their higher reliance upon rent for their existence.
Thanks very much,
Good comment
Randy.
there.
I agree. Is there another comment?
Peter, I wonder if you could fast forward to
let's try that,
slide.
yeah, because I whittled them down quite a bit. Sorry, I whittled them down quite a bit, but apparently still I overestimated my speed.
Why don't we go to the commonalities and implications?
Good point, because you will have this also available on the site.
Yes.
Oops, what is happening here?
While Peter's getting to that slide, let me just make a quick comment. One is that viewers will have noted that we did not report statistical results on these slides, and this is in part due to the small number of OCBSA incubator respondents. So for the statistical analyses that we did conduct, which are reported elsewhere, including online at the Regional Research Institute working paper series, we tested each geographical area individually in a statistical sense, and then we also created an additional geographical category by combining the micro and OCBSA categories. So you'll be able to look at some of those statistical results if you're interested on the working paper series and in publications that will be forthcoming.
And we'll put a link to that right next to the webinar archive.
Correct.
So
Thank you, Scott.
Well, I don't have to say much about the first finding because we've seen this in a number of instances quite clearly. The second one, there is an omission there which renders this one actually incorrect. Only a small number of mostly metro incubators are private for profit should be there too. Then it is correct. For some reason, I left out the for profit there. I don't know why. This is an important point from a research, but also I think from a consulting perspective, and that there is not yet an official standard for data collection quite in place. I'm sure, although I have not checked that NPIA is probably working on something or might be working on something like that. But at the present time, I'm not aware of any. And because of that, it's difficult to assess incubators comparatively, because you are not necessarily having the same type of information available or at the same level of frequency and accuracy. Therefore, this one here, self-evaluation by incubators, is frequently deficient. And universities are very important, provide, even though fewer universities co-locate or with incubators in the rural areas or incubators with universities than in the metro areas, in the OCPSA areas than in the metro areas. The reliance on universities for at least some support in a couple of areas seems to be greater in the rural areas than in metro or micro. I already mentioned that the rental income was important. We found that almost everywhere we went to visit that to be the case, and that's why you have this problem here, leaving at graduation versus rental income trade-off. And some said very bluntly that no, they're not asking people to leave. Another point here is that existing buildings. I have some experience working in economic development, as do all of you, and sometimes we jump at an opportunity, and sometimes the incubator is housed in a building because that building was available. But it is sometimes the case that that building is really not appropriate because it cannot accommodate the type of businesses that might have the best and most promise in your region. So it is important to consider the constraints that are imposed by existing buildings. Maybe sometimes we have to say no, we have to wait until something more appropriate comes about, or otherwise adjust what we do. And a somewhat related point is that incubators, and particularly rural incubators, serve multiple needs and have several sponsors. I think I have one more comment. No, I have one more comment I would make in conjunction with this. We had a visit to one incubator in Maryland. I've forgotten to mention Maryland before. As another area where we visited, that is sponsored by county and a community college. It seems to be a very good partnership or a good cooperation. That's one where I thought they also had some good ideas in how they pull in students to work, helping both the tenants and the students. But it's a very specialized space because it is, and I forgot now the technical term, but it's secure space. What that means is you can't just walk in there. And because it's a secure space, they can bid for contracts that require some security clearance. And that's not just the federal government, that could also be the case if you work, for example, for medical organizations. They also want to be sure that their records aren't seen by the wrong eyes. That works nicely, and those businesses have been, several of them have been actually successful. The problem is they can't leave, or if they leave, they have to leave the county, because there is no other secure site in that rural county. So we didn't go through everything. I'm sorry for, well, not sorry, but I misjudged my speed, but I hope that you have seen some information and heard some information that helps you to maybe formulate some questions in your own work with incubators more precisely. That's what
well, thank you, Peter and Randy. That's great. I think it's a very interesting set of information that you've been able to develop there. I have a couple questions as we allow people to click on the summary evaluation. Maybe we can go to Tim's first. Tim is asking about whether, if you got a larger service area for a food incubator, would that help make that more successful? So that would be one question.
That's a very good question. I think it probably would help, but it might in some cases also be difficult to achieve. If you were looking at kind of these businesses, food businesses that make salsas and jams, and so many of them will not be big enough to justify coming a distance of more than a comparatively small lengths. 100 miles, I think, would be too big. But if you talk about businesses that have turned that into a real thriving business, as there are some West Virginia firms, you can buy their jams in our grocery stores, and you can buy, I think, at Walmart and Sam's. And for a business like that, I think if you have more of them, then it will be easier for the incubator to make a success out of it. Because as you know, these industrial kitchens aren't exactly cheap, and they also require maintenance and cleaning and all those things. And so you need to have enough business to be able to recoup the costs that you have to put in first.
You came up with I thought, kind of a neat statement there about incubating the incubators, and how might one, what would be the sort of the priority areas to work on? It sounds like maybe business plan evaluation, but what about sort of general feasibility things or marketing, such as Tim has kind of alluded to? Are those sorts of services the things that might help more of these become a little more viable? What about site location? I found myself wondering if you guys had thought of going onto Google Street View and actually doing a visual assessment of the location of each of these, if you have their address, tying that back to the results. So if you get somebody
that's a very good idea, actually. I wasn't even aware of that until recently. I saw it on TV and thought it was very nice. So the answer is no, we haven't done that. The only ones that we have seen, kind of a street view, are the ones to be visited. And I forget how many it is. It's not a very large number. I think it's about 12.
But if you're going to offer technical services to these rural incubators, what would be the top priority technical services that you would
I really
offer?
think with respect to evaluation, both themselves, understanding, do we have what we need? Because I think sometimes it's possible that you have more of something that's not important and less of something that you need, particularly with respect to relatively expensive equipment, and particularly if you get it for free. We saw actually a very good incubator at East Tennessee or Eastern Tennessee State University that is located in old Army building. It's a very good facility because the Army, luckily, they cook, they have heavy equipment, therefore the carrying capacity of floors is very high, and so it's a good building. They had also some very nice meeting rooms and offices, and so one of the best I've seen personally, particularly clearly the best rural one in terms of facilities. And in that case, it was very lucky. In other words, the gift, I think, was a very good gift. It was a gift that supports the needs of that incubator. But in other cases, I think, as I said before, they are there because that's what's available. Like we have one in the storefront, and the executive director of that store mentioned some of the difficulties that has caused for them. And I should add here, Scott, the turnover, at least in the rural areas, and particularly in those that we visited, of the executive director is too high for the incubators to be successful. And the reason is they don't pay enough, and some of them are, in addition, only part-time. And so you have people coming in, some of them very impressive, starting their new life, new professional life in the region as an executive director or an employee of an incubator, but moving on to something else because their skills permit them once they have a network.
If I could sort of piggyback on that, technical assistance, I agree with Peter, would be one of the assistance in terms of evaluation of performance would be useful. But I think that it's really important to sort of return to where we began, which is that small area business incubators have special challenges. And if I could just sort of point to some a small set of related findings that I think is particularly telling, is that because they have such small populations to draw from, these small area incubators tend not to restrict tenants by industry sector. They tend not to have strict entrance requirements of any kind. They tend not to force exit upon graduation. And again, further, partly because of their need to generate rents, and also I think partly because they can fill more general community needs, they also tend to serve purposes that extend above and beyond the roles of traditional business incubators. So that's sort of my takeaway from much of the findings that we just uncovered.
And matter of fact, the incubator that's listed or is shown, the photograph of its front on the last slide, you can see it right now. Yep, that one. It's in Kaiser, West Virginia, and it's a former high school. And that one serves quite a few different purposes. It's partly incubator, it's partly an office building, or even more generally a business building. It's also a meeting place because there's no good facilities and because they store old trophies from many years back that high school students at the time who were there earned or won. They also get traffic of former students there for reunions and things like that. So it plays a lot. And that, by the way, is a private for-profit incubator.
So in many cases, the small area, in many cases then the small area incubators almost play, in addition to their incubator role, they almost play the role of a kind of community center.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was
particularly
thinking
for businesses.
That one slide where there's multiple things going on. That may be why they have a hard time talking about objectives. But Paula Jensen had a question about whether USDA rural development loans could be possibly used to jumpstart these kinds of facilities.
I'm not sure. I'm probably less optimistic than I used to be. As Scott knows, I once worked with two not-for-profits, and I have found it extraordinarily challenging that if you don't have a steady stream of income that covers your basic costs, the necessities, like the light and the water, things like that, the grant will help you to start up, and then as soon as the grant runs out, you close up. And so it's extremely challenging to do it that way. None of the two incubators, not-for-profits that I worked on, we were very successful for a while, and none of them is functional anymore. Actually, one has it does not exist anymore. The other still exists, but it's not much going on.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think I'll turn off the recording.
Can I say something?